In the United States, the justice system is often seen as a pillar of fairness and equality, but for African Americans, that ideal remains far from reality. From unequal treatment in courtrooms to disproportionate policing, the promise of justice seems tilted against them. This isn't just a matter of statistics, it's a lived experience that stretches across generations, leaving many to question whether the system is truly designed to protect or to punish. In exploring this issue, one truth becomes clear. Racial discrimination in the justice system is not just a relic of the past, it's a present-day crisis. Beyond a conceptual idea of discrimination, the numbers back up the same argument. So let's take a look at a handful of these rapid-fire stats to better understand the extent to which the criminal justice system discriminates against African Americans. Number one, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, over half the individuals exonerated from death row are Black. An exoneree is someone that is proven guilty of a crime that they did not commit. Number two, in tandem with that, the second statistic I'd like to share is that 78.8% of those cases were shown to have some sort of official misconduct by police, prosecutors, or government officials. Number three, almost half of individuals on death row are Black. It is also important to note that the death penalty is utilized primarily in cases where someone white is murdered. In fact, nearly 300 Black people accused of murdering white people have been executed since 1976. On the other hand, only 21 white people accused of murdering someone Black have been executed. Number four, the Death Penalty Information Center also discusses that on average, it takes longer to exonerate an innocent Black person. They spend roughly 13.8 years wrongfully imprisoned, which is about 45% longer than an innocent white person. This also holds up in different types of convictions. Number five, Black people generally receive more harsh sentences when accused of sexual assault, roughly 4.5 more years than someone who is white. Number six, and finally, Black people are more likely to be stopped and searched, even when no crime has occurred, as shown in a 2020 study. Additionally, that disparity goes down at night when it becomes more difficult to distinguish the race of who is driving. The discrimination present within the justice system has become a concern that is fairly well recognized, to a point that there are many potential legislative efforts to improve the state of the justice system. The first one is the California Racial Justice Act. Challenging criminal convictions as being racially discriminatory is nearly impossible following the 1987 decision of McCleskey versus Kemp. This stated that a defendant has to prove that the decision makers in his case acted with discriminatory purpose without being applied in a greater context. However, the case was determined as minimum enforcement for all states, so California opted to provide greater protection and then passed the California Racial Justice Act. The act does not allow for a criminal conviction to be imposed based on race, but if the trial is found to contain bias, there are protections in place to reverse the decision in the same way. The next one is a federal act that has not yet been passed, but has garnered much support from the House of Representatives, and it's the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act. The End Racial and Religious Profiling Act would prohibit federal, state, and local law enforcement from targeting a person based on actual or perceived race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation without some sort of trustworthy information that is relevant to linking a person to a crime. Finally, President Biden signed an executive order on May 25th, 2022, titled Advancing Effective, Accountable Policing and Criminal Justice Practices to Enhance Public Trust and Public Safety. It created 10 different key requests. One, a creation of National Law Enforcement Accountability Database to track police conduct. Two, banning chokeholding, carotid restraints. Number three, restricting no-knock warrants. Four, use of body cam cameras. Five, strengthening use of force standards. Six, promote de-escalation techniques. Seven, improve officer wellness and support. Eight, address the systemic racism in policing. Nine, encourage local law enforcement to adopt similar reforms to the federal level. And the 10th one is independent investigations into misconduct. Realistically, the problem of discrimination in the United States justice system is undeniable, and tactics to move forward in handling the problem have been underway for years.
I'm going to go over the origins of racial bias in drug policy, which can be seen in the war on drugs, which was initiated in the 1970s under President Nixon. And it was truly rooted in racial bias. Nixon's policy advisor revealed the true intent behind this campaign. He stated that while they couldn't explicitly target blacks or anti-war activists, they could disrupt these communities by associating blacks with heroin and hippies with marijuana, then criminalizing both heavily. This strategy shaped drug policies based on racial stereotypes rather than public health concerns. The impact of these policies on African Americans has been devastatingly disproportionate. While blacks make up only 14.4% of the US population, according to the 2022 Pew Research Center, their incarceration rates for drug offenses are staggering. The overall state admission rate for drug offenses is 10 times higher for blacks than for whites. Black men are sent to prison on drug charges at 11.8 times the rate of white men, and black women at 4.8 times the rate of white women. Of these admitted to state prisons with new convictions for drug offenses, 53.5% are black and only 33.3% are white, which is a very concerning statistic, especially when accounting for the fact that blacks only make up 14.4% of the US population, according to the 2022 research. This disparity is partly due to the targeting of urban areas with visible drug markets, which are often predominantly black neighborhoods. The focus on crack cocaine associated with black communities versus powder cocaine, more common in white communities, exemplifies this bias. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act established a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powdered cocaine, leading to a dramatic increase in the incarceration of African Americans. Instead of emphasizing treatment and prevention in minority communities, the criminal justice system had a focus on arrest and incarceration, which was targeted to African Americans. The racial disparities extend beyond drug offenses to sentencing in general. African Americans are 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites, and Hispanics are 3.1 times as likely. Studies show that non-whites are both more likely to be incarcerated and more likely to receive longer sentences than whites for similar offenses. The system particularly disadvantages lower income African Americans. Up to 1/3 of the estimated disparity is driven by the ability to pay for fines in the criminal justice system. The judiciary's reliance on fines creates further discrepancies between the sentencing of whites and minorities, especially in white-collar proceedings. This financial barrier disproportionately affects African Americans who are more likely to come in with lower income backgrounds. From its inception, the war on drugs, to current sentencing practices, the criminal justice system has shown a persistent bias against African Americans. This bias is evident in drug policies, enforcement strategies, and sentencing disparities, creating a system that unfairly targets and punishes African American communities.
I would like to address Patrick Warwell's argument in taking sides. He is the individual in our textbook arguing that the criminal justice system is not discriminatory against black Americans. In his argument, he presents two possible causes of the higher arrest and conviction rates for black Americans. He presents the idea that crime is tied to poverty levels and not to racial groupings. And the other idea is this idea of a violent African subculture. And I've quoted some of what he said here. So he cites that some thinkers have proposed the idea that black Americans have developed a culture of violence for some reason. This argument lacks a lot of citation and specifics. It's very unsubstantial, and not worth addressing any further because it's not substantiated. And the argument that crime is tied to poverty and not race, and that why it isn't systemically discriminatory, that falls apart when we examine why black Americans have higher rates of poverty. So, when you look at a history of economic oppression, there have been many, many different laws that have oppressed black Americans financially. That includes large-scale chattel slavery, and then the sharecropping system that popped up after slavery was abolished, forced prison labor, Jim Crow segregation laws, voter disenfranchisement. These policies all kept Americans from building generational wealth. So working, earning an equal pay for their labor, and just getting income and building that generational wealth from generation to generation. The Federal Housing Administration employed redlining starting in 1934, which means they would refuse to underwrite houses for black Americans specifically, and then they would refuse to do it in neighborhoods where black Americans moved in because black Americans presented an increased risk of danger. And that kept black Americans from purchasing homes, and it also kept black Americans from moving into, like, higher class white neighborhoods, so it kept black Americans either homeless or stuck in poorer neighborhoods. This was undone in the 1968 Fair Housing Act legally, but that's another contribution to why black Americans have failed to accrue generational wealth. And if you look at poverty today, the effect of these policies, 44% of black Americans own home, while 75% of white Americans do. Black Americans have an incredibly disproportionately high rate of homelessness. They have the lowest median income of all the different races. In 2019, it was found that the average white household income was $76,000, while the average black household income was $46,000. Black Americans are also more likely to work hourly poverty wage jobs, and they are more likely to be paid less than their white coworkers, even if they have equal qualifications. And for the last 70 years, black Americans have been twice as likely to be unemployed than white Americans. So you bring all of this together, you bring the history and the effects together, and coming back to criminal justice, there is substantial evidence that black Americans have been discriminated against economically, and that it has created income inequality and wealth inequality today. So Warwell's argument that crime rates are tied to poverty and thus aren't discriminatory falls apart under this evidence, because the criminal justice system does not exist in a vacuum in our society. It interacts with all of our different systems, including our economic systems. So if black Americans economically and systemically have been discriminated against, in the financial department, then the criminal justice system builds off of that discriminatory system and kind of brings them together. So it is still discriminatory even though the cause is in another system.
All right, so for my portion of this presentation, I'm just giving the present day, what the discrimination and what African Americans endure on a daily in America. So to start off, I wanted to talk about some information that was from our textbook. Our textbook gave a common statement that people try to use to cover up the discrimination that Black people endure, and that is, in quotes, Black people commit more crimes than white people, end quotation. This fact is used to justify a belief that Black people have a natural criminal propensity, or that a culture of violence is to blame for problems faced by Black people in America. Also, Black people make up 16% of the US population, while white people make up 69%. However, Black people make up 40% of the US population in prisons, in our US prisons, while white people only make up 39%. Blacks and whites are incarcerated in an almost equal amount, even though whites dominate the Black community in America. And also, Blacks are incarcerated 5 times more than whites. I want to also talk about some present day police brutality and discrimination that Blacks in America go through every day. In 2020, social media allowed the world to see a perspective that most of America didn't even realize was going on. We were able to see how many African Americans were being discriminated by the police, and so many of the African Americans that died at the hands of the police. Some examples that I'm going to include are Andre Hill, Manuel Ellis, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. So for Andre Hill, he died on December 22nd, 2020. Andre died by gunfire when he was exiting his friend's home that he was visiting. The police were called to the home because a neighbor called 911 about a car that kept getting turned on and off and never moving from the same spot at the residence. The police came to make sure everything was okay and asked that Andre exit the home. In the body cam footage, we can see that Andre is leaving the garage with his phone in his left hand and his right hand in his pocket. As soon as he goes around the vehicle in the garage, the officer pulls out his weapon and begins shooting with no reason. The officer tried to say he believed he saw Andre pulling a weapon out. However, nowhere in the body cam footage we see Andre pulling his right hand out of his pocket with a weapon of any sort. For Manuel Ellis, he died on March 3rd, 2020. Manuel was killed while he was walking home from a convenience store. Officers slammed the patrol car door into him, causing Manuel to be knocked to the ground by the force of impact. Tacoma Police Department officers Christopher Burbank and Matthew Collins tackled him and began to struck Ellis multiple times. The force these officers were using in the arrest they were making and the unneeded violence caused Manuel to lose his life. George Floyd, which we've heard his name multiple times, he died on May 25th, 2020. George Floyd allegedly tried to use a counterfeit $20 bill, and the store called 911 because of this. Floyd was then handcuffed onto the ground as Officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Floyd pleaded with the four officers present and repeatedly told them he was unable to breathe with the weight of the officer kneeling into his neck. Despite his pleas, Chauvin kept his knee on Floyd's neck even when he became unresponsive. 2 autopsy reports listed Floyd's death as a homicide, although they gave different charges to the officers. Breonna Taylor died on March 13th, 2020. Breonna Taylor was at home asleep with her boyfriend Kenneth Walker when 3 plainclothes officers arrived at their apartment. These officers claimed that they were there to execute a search warrant in a drug case. However, Walker and Taylor didn't know that and believed that this was an intrusion because the officers forced their entry into the home and were not in uniform. Walker began to call 911 and fired his licensed firearm in self-defense. Taylor, who was unarmed, was shot 8 times. I wanted to also include an NYU study on being stopped by the police. This study was undertaken by Robbie Schroff, an assistant professor holding joint appointments at NYU Steinhardt and NYU CUSP, and his colleagues at the Stanford Open Policing Project. They found that in a database of nearly 100 million traffic stops across the United States, Black drivers were about 20% more likely to be stopped than white drivers relative to their share of the residential population. Schroff and his colleagues also measured the disparity in stops rates before and after sunset. They found that Black drivers made up a smaller share of those stopped at night when it's more difficult to discern the race of a driver, which suggests the racial bias that may influence stop decisions. For example, in Texas, about 25% of drivers stopped right before sunset were Black, compared to about 20% just after dusk. And that's a huge, huge percentage when you really think about that. So to wrap it all up, this presentation has only given the bare bones of the discrimination and abuse African Americans endure by the police daily. Many officers use their position of power to torture the African American people because of their racist beliefs and feelings. So many Americans fear for their lives on a daily just because of their race. This has to end. We understand that not all officers are racist and target African Americans. However, a large portion are still part of our law enforcement, which are the people that are sworn to protect the American people, and that includes the African American people. Organizations like BLM are bringing awareness to this topic, and we need to have a stance. We need to change our criminal justice system to have the legislation and people working in our system to start saving our African American lives, not killing them. This is my work cited for my portion of the presentation. Thank you so much for watching.